Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make a few swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. The commander we're discussing in this video really proves that where there's a Wilhelt, there's a way. Wilhelt the Rotcleaver is our latest entry to the cast of blue-black zombie tribal decks, and he's proving to be extremely popular, already commanding nearly 700 decks. This should be no surprise since zombies are the third most popular tribe according to EDHREC. Wilhelt happily lets us eat up a zombie at the end of turn to draw a card, and whenever our non-decaying zombies die, he'll replace them with a decayed zombie, which cannot block and can attack exactly once before falling apart, but once is often all we need. Wilhelt's page will look familiar to anyone who's been playing Verena, Scarab God, Gisa and Geralf, and many other zombie tribal commanders. Zombies have tons of lords to pump each other up, plus a bunch of helpful spells to bring back our ghouls, giving our horde that true feeling of relentless inexorability that makes for a classic Night of the Living Dead. Let's go ahead and grab Wilhelt's average deck from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps made to the deck must either keep the total price cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the list. Brains. There are some seriously impressive zombies in this list. I count no fewer than 7 zombie lords that pump up the rest of the army, not including the enchantments that can pump them up as well. And I also count no fewer than 20 cards that can make zombie tokens. Wilhelt is probably one of my favorite precon decks Wizards has ever released. And I promise, I'm not just saying that because one of the zombies bit me and it's starting to get to my head a little bit. Before we make any changes, let's get acquainted with the core cards in the deck. First, the Lords. Undead Warchief in particular is just a phenomenal piece of work, and I'm so happy that Death Baron is less expensive to acquire nowadays. In addition to this, we've got some great cards that amplify the whole lot. Noxious Ghoul is savage tech to eliminate enemy blockers, and Diagraph Colossus makes so many tokens that it's frankly kind of concerning. I was prepared to be unimpressed by Dreadhorde Invasion, but then I played it, and it's got amazing synergy with our commander, who constantly eats the amassed zombie tokens to draw cards. I also just want Cleaver Scob to repeatedly make multiple copies of Grey Merchant of Asphodel for me. Like, please? Is that too much to ask? Also, Zombie Apocalypse is so good that it makes me want to stop making this video right now and just go play Commander right this very second. Seriously, it's so exciting! And these cards are made even more impressive due to the fact that, unlike a lot of other zombie tribal commanders, Wilhelt is actually a zombie himself, which is extremely important. The big thing we have to address, though, is that Wilhelt is starting to become an appealing zombie combo commander. There's an obvious combo that a lot of zombie players are already familiar with: Rooftop Storm, Gravecrawler, and a Sack Outlet. Rooftop makes it free to repeatedly cast the Crawler, which can constantly come back and get sacrificed all over again. With an Altar, this means infinite mana. With a card like Diagraph Captain, it means you just win the game. This isn't the only thing Rooftop Storm combos with either. A Sararac will infinitely bounce back to hand and infinitely venture into either of these 2 dungeons, which is again pretty darn lethal, particularly with the Lost Mines of Phandelver. This actually isn't the only infinite combo in the deck either. Poppet Stitcher is a token maker that flips into Poppet Factory, a card that removes all abilities from our zombie tokens, namely the Decayed ability. Thus, when Wilhelt sees any zombie token die, he'll make a new one, and even though that new token technically has decayed, the factory takes the decay away, which means that any sacrifice outlet, once again, lets us go infinite. We haven't even gotten started yet, but when we see infinite combos crop up in an average deck list, I feel like it warrants a discussion. I am going to choose to honor the infinite combos that we see in the original average deck list. It's not something I'm going to go out of my way to make the entire focus of the deck around a combo or anything like that, but it is basically the attitude of, I don't know, if the combos happen, then cool, they happen. But if you're not personally a fan of infinite combos, don't worry. I have some honorable mentions for other options, future upgrades, and even budget recommendations at the end of the video. Like I said, the deck won't be built around these combos, but we know they're here. Sometimes our zombies are slow shamblers, but sometimes they sprint. Now, with a better understanding of how our horde works, let's get upgrading. I'd like to tackle this list in the following 3 ways: Dawn of the Dead, 28 Days Later, and of course, Zombieland. Let's start off with part 1. The first stage of our zombie infection starts with just a couple of simple upgrades to our undead servants. Some of them are being a little bit too slow to get out of their graves in the morning. First things first, Champion of the Perished is a hilarious pun on the card Champion of the Parish, but it's not a stunning performer in a zombie EDH deck. One big zombie with no keywords isn't as important to us in a go-wide army deck. I also found myself less impressed than I thought I would be by Curse of the Restless Dead. This one really surprised me. You put it on like a landfall player and it seems like a complete winner. The problem I had was just that the zombies it makes are decayed zombies. Whenever possible, I feel like Wilhelt really likes our first batch of zombies to be undecayed, because he'll replace those ones with a fresh new crop of Brain Eaters that are decayed. Maybe your mileage will vary on this card, I just didn't find it as consistent as I had hoped. Since not every pod contains a landfall player, and in any case, I found other token makers to be twice as effective considering Wilhelt's ability. It really is the token makers I'm honing in on for this section. It's okay though, like I said, we have over 20 of them, maybe even 25, so we can afford to be choosy about which token makers we want to play. Open the Graves is the next card that came under my scrutiny. 5 mana is a lot for an effect that only works when our actual creatures die. When playtesting, I swapped this across for a Reflections of Lityara, and I was so dang happy when I did. Twice as many zombie lords? Twice as many Grey Merchants? It even does a funny dance when we cast Wilhelt, because the copy will enter, and then the actual Wilhelt will enter. One will die, and our commander will see that zombie died, and will make a decayed replacement. That's pretty dang funny. And also, y'all, I want 2 Undead War Chiefs. On the subject of straight across swaps, I didn't much care for Dread Summons. I've seen this card make a good 5 tokens sometimes, but I've also witnessed it whiff completely. It scales to the late game, I guess, but even then, it costs a lot of mana, doesn't affect the board state, might fuel up an enemy Muldrotha player across the table, and the tokens enter tapped. I found myself wishing instead that I had the much more reliable Noosegraph Mob. In conjunction with Wilhelt, this is technically 12 bodies on one card. With all the other zombie lords pumping stuff up, it might not even die when the last counter is removed. I'm seriously very impressed with this card every time I see it. Ooh, before I forget, Bladestitch Scob is a brand new zombie from Midnight Hunt that I don't yet see in this average deck list. It's tiny, but I love it. We don't even care that much about it only pumping up power instead of pumping up toughness too. I mean, power is what we want for our Ravenous Horde. Let's get that guy in here. Alright, this next part is gonna be tough. I wanted to save this until like the end of the video, but it honestly does belong in this section, so let's talk about Endless Ranks of the Dead. So this is a beautiful card, probably doesn't get any more on theme than this. However, I don't think it's actually a great card. It takes a full turn before it can even take effect, and it requires us to have a minimum of 2 zombies in play for it to actually do anything. I wound up with plenty of turns where this card just didn't do anything whatsoever. That's a tough sell these days. If you want to keep this card in the deck because of its epic theming, then absolutely keep it for sure. It's also just like masterfully stunning art by Ryan Yi, and frankly, that is reason enough to keep it in any deck. So feel free to ignore me when I propose swapping it out, especially since the card I would be swapping it for doesn't actually depict any zombies at all. That's Bastion of Remembrance. In the words of Gaurav Gulati from the Command Zone, humans are just zombies that don't know it yet. There's a lot of sacrifice that happens in this deck, including those infinite combos we saw earlier, and I think this could be a pretty important ingredient in helping our zombies get that final push of damage through against our enemies, and especially punishing them even if they try to wipe our board. That should do it for Section 1, so let's get a move on, because Section 2 is looking pretty swift. Zombies can be hard to kill, but our opponent's stuff shouldn't be. I want to use this section just to upgrade our removal a smidge more, to make sure that our opponents are never able to escape, even from our crawlers and ankle biters. Go for the Throat is a neat card, but I think it's gotten outclassed these days. I'm going to opt for Reality Shift instead, because the Exile is very useful against indestructible creatures. The next instant I puzzled over was Ether Spouts. I like combat trickery cards like this a lot. Fog effects can be really powerful against unsuspecting enemies. However, I didn't feel like this was the type of deck that had a lot of cause to leave up 5 mana. This is a pretty straightforward, aggressive, relentless type of deck, and when we're such a brainless, chompy strategy, it makes it kinda hard to leave up 5 mana without it being an obvious signal. Instead, I found myself hunting for a more thematic method of removing enemy nuisances, and that landed me on the card Necrotic Hex. What a board wipe. Removes a ton of creatures and gives us 6 new Shamblers to play with next turn? That's a pretty tectonic shift. Against enemy token decks, yes, it can totally struggle, but our deck already contains other ways of mitigating against token players. I liken this card to Martial Coup, which is a great card in token decks. So this removal effect that also makes us tons of zombies just can't be ignored. And you know what? Neither can zombie making protection effects either. Lazatep plating, get your butt in here. Amass a zombie and protect our board. And we can even protect ourselves if someone tries to point to some big X damage spell at our face. The more I see this card, the more it impresses me. And that's especially true in a deck that will also make tons of use out of that extra zombie token. Okay, we're nearly done, but the humans are working on a cure to eliminate our zombie plague. We can't let that happen, so let's turn the world into a true and proper zombie land. Earlier, I mentioned some zombie tribal payoff cards, like Reflections of Lityara and all that, but let's lean into that even more. What happens when our zombies start to get clever? First stop, a mana rock. Charcoal Diamond came in the Wilhelt precon, and it's perfectly respectable, but when our commander makes tokens, I personally reach for a Heraldic Banner to make them even more punchy. Heck, with all the different buff effects we've got running around in this deck, it actually gets pretty darn feasible for the secondary clause on Dreadhorde Invasion to give our zombie tokens lifelink. On the subject of big zombies though, there is a big one that I am going to end up chopping. I never once found Gravespawn Sovereign useful. 5 zombies is a lot, 6 mana is a lot, and the circumstances required here would need a very particular stage of the game where we'd want to get back one specific creature rather than just attack with a bunch of our zombies. On that note, I really love the card Drown in Dreams, but not necessarily for this commander. What a cool card, like dang, I love it, put that into a Bruvac deck yesterday. But here, we just don't necessarily need it. I'm afraid I also found myself feeling similarly about Village Rites, especially since we have a lot of sacrifice outlets in the deck already. I wanted something a bit more substantial than both of these, since I think we can get more impactful card selection and advantage than by paying these types of costs. There's a Distant Melody wisely located in the original average deck, and I was very happy to add a Pact of the Serpent to join it. This gets a big ol' batch of cards into our hand, and even if the life payment ends up being steep, that just means we're about to do even more damage to our enemies. Heck, I've even used this against an elf player to make them lose the game because they had too many elves. What a deliciously flexible spell. I also want to give it up for the ironically named Pyre of Heroes. Sacrifice Outlet, Birthing Pod Imitator. I love this card in this deck. Sack some token to go find a Crypt Breaker, sack that for an Undead Augur, sack Augur to go find a useful zombie lord, sacrifice that lord for an even bigger lord, or sacrifice that bigger lord for like removal. This is a tricky card that doesn't excel in every single tribal deck out there, but this zombie list has the right mix of toolbox effects and repetition to make it extremely worthwhile. And goodness, Wilhelt will even make us tokens when we make these sacrifices. Love it. There's one thing missing, but what could it be? We've got zombie lords, and zombie removal effects, and zombie token makers, and zombies that punish the living daylights out of our opponents whenever our creatures die. Oh, yeah, Vengeful Dead. Why aren't you in this deck yet? Get in there, friend. Go ahead, opponent. I dare you to cast that board wipe. I promise it won't bite. That does it for our swaps, but before we wrap up, let's go over some honorable mentions. First, if you're not interested in the combos of this deck, opt out of the Acererak and the Gravecaller. Those are some big culprits for combo, and that saves you like $40 anyway. And feel free to use those empty card slots to flesh out the mana base a little bit more, and maybe add 1 or 2 more lands to the deck. I found the land count to be okay, since the curve on the deck isn't extravagantly high and the commander is a decent draw engine, but a little more consistency never hurt anybody. In addition to this, here are the 3 most expensive cards in the deck, and if you ignore getting those, you save an extra $70, which is awesome. These cards are good for sure, but it's not like they're vital organs for the deck to function. And even if they were, come on, we're zombies. We don't need vital organs to function. Here are a few other cards I'd be interested to pursue for a more budget-friendly version of the deck. Necromantic Selection is another board wipe that keeps us with a zombie on board, which is a great thing for flavor and function. Shepherd of Rod is also pretty nasty if you can wield it wisely, so keep your eye out for that one too. And finally, I gotta tip my hat to Vizier of the Scorpion. With Wilhelt, that's 4 bodies on 1 card. That's pretty dang good, and the Death Touch is just the cherry on top. So what if you're upgrading the deck even more? What other future upgrades could a more lavish zombie deck look forward to? Well, it's tricky, because there are some very expensive zombie cards out there. Rothulk is quite pricey now, for instance, and the Meathook Massacre, another card that helps us out with those infinite combos and is just pretty dang good in general, also costs approximately ludicrous dollars and bonkers cents to acquire. Beyond those, the Kindred cards are also just splendid for any tribal deck too. And even Zombie Master and Skull Clamp are like $10 each these days. If you do have access to these upgrades, I suspect that some of the less consistent cards start to fall away from the deck. Rise of the Dreadmarn, Liliana, and the Wand are cool, but can be shaky sometimes, and Dark Salvation, Ghoul's Night Out, and Eternal Skylord may prove a little bit slow when the deck starts to get slimmer and sleeker. And the same fate may even befall Undead Alchemist and the Rotbelly, which is a shame, because I personally like those cards a lot, but I will admit that they are a bit demanding on the strategy sometimes. I suspect that players may also upgrade their sacrifice outlets to great effect as well, perhaps exchanging one altar for another, or, more likely, exchanging a carrion feeder for an Altar of Dementia, which is both sacrifice outlet and win condition for the Grave Crawler combo. And you know what, in addition to all of this, I think it's genuinely important for this deck to run Snow Basics. Not even because of Narfi, although, for the record, that's a cool card. No, I actually think it's important to have Snow Basics because of Field of the Dead. If you upgrade into a Field of the Dead for this deck and use Snow Basics, you can increase your chances of creating zombie tokens if you use more lands with different names. So a mix of those regular and Snow Basics gives you more differently named lands for Field of the Dead to start spreading out an undead curse across the world. However, there are two main upgrades that I'd want to make to this deck if the budget allows for it. The first is a pet card you've heard me ramble about plenty already, Tombstone Stairwell. This card was less than $3 when I first started praising it in these videos, but it has grown up quite a lot since then. It remains an aristocratic nightmare for your enemies, proccing bazillions of death triggers that our zombies love to witness. And when those zombie tomb spawn tokens are destroyed every turn, Wilhelt has an absolute field day, making more zombies to replace them. But the last card I want to mention is a bit of a twist, and that's the card Blade of Selves. This card's just fun in general, especially when you have Enter the Battlefield effects that you'd like to duplicate, but it's got a lot of extra usefulness in this deck specifically. Equip it to a Zombie Lord, and we're getting tons more pump for our army during combat. If we have a sacrifice outlet, we can even sacrifice the bonus tokens after damage is dealt, but before combat is officially over, so that Wilhelt will proc the death triggers. But speaking of Wilhelt, he is actually the reason I think the Blade of Selves is so much fun here. Most of the time, it's not useful to equip a Blade of Selves to a legendary creature, because the copies will just immediately die. But in Wilhelt's case, that's great! Each copy of Wilhelt will also see the others die, so they'll provide us with a ton of extra zombie tokens on the way out the door. This kooky type of interaction in EDH is exactly the kind of thing that just gives me life. Or, well, unlife. Alright, I think we're all done here. Behold our beautiful zombie horde in all its glory. You can find a link for the list in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you enjoyed the zombie apocalypse, and of course, Wilhelt had a great time too. If you have any other recommendations for cards that you think your fellow Wilhelt players ought to play in their decks as well, make sure you leave those in the comments below. And as always, thanks so much for watching.